Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our breakout session, Framing Multilingualism as a Resource for Standards-Aligned Instruction. My name is Nelson Flores. I'm an associate professor at the University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Education, and I am also a CSAIL researcher, and I will be moderating this breakout session. I first wanted to introduce Erica Saldívar García, who will be my co-moderator. Erica is a researcher with CSAIL and is also a clinical assistant professor of TESOL, bilingual and foreign language education in the Multilingual Multicultural Studies program in the Department of Teaching and Learning at NYU Steinhardt School. She will be co-moderating with me and we'll be taking some of the questions if we get any from the audience. Before beginning, I just wanted to go over some logistics. Next slide. Nope, next slide. Audio is muted. So we have muted attendees for the duration of the session, but there is a question box that you should see in your GoWebinar control panel where you could submit questions. Erica, the co-moderator, will be monitoring and posing your questions to the panelists when we get to the Q&A. So feel free to put any questions in the question box. If we're not able to get to them in the session, we will also be sharing emails with the panelists that you can contact them directly, and we will also try to answer the questions on CSAIL's website. Closed captioning is being provided. You can get to that link here for live captioning, and then the link will also be shared in the question box. You should use the gear icon in the live captioning window to change the font size and more to your convenience. Next slide. Before introducing the panelists, I just wanted to kind of talk about the purpose of the panel. So more students are coming into classrooms from homes where languages other than English are spoken. But the dominant framing of the conversation has been around English learners, which erases the bilingual and multilingualism of students who are not classified as English learners, and also is a missed opportunity for framing the bilingualism and multilingualism of students classified as English learners as a resource for teaching and learning. So in the spirit of not erasing multilingualism from the conversation, we wanted to begin with a poll. If you could put up the first poll, which asks about how many languages you speak. And be honest, we want to see how many languages you would identify as speaking, interpreting that however you interpret speaking a language. So 1, 2, 3, or more than 3. So I'll just give you 30 seconds to pick your answer, and then we'll look at the results before getting into the panel. All right, could we put up the results? So it looks like more than half of the people speak more than at least 2 languages. Well, actually, most of you speak at least 2 or 3 languages. And 16% speak 1 language. And so that's just interesting background information that we have for ourselves and where we're coming from. To kind of begin to think about the multilingualism of the audience, right? And kind of acknowledging the multilingualism of all of the people in the audience. Now, the recent expansion of dual language education and other efforts to promote heritage and world languages in schools within the context of standards-based reform have certainly begun to raise conversations about framing multilingualism as a resource. However, many would argue that there's more that we could do to really frame multilingualism as a resource. So this panel brings together a range of experts working in various positions on these issues. So if we could close those results. I'm going to begin by introducing each of the panelists. So Samuel Aguirre, who should be popping up in a second, is the director of WIDA-ESPAñOL at WIDA at the Wisconsin Center for Education Research out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He manages the research, development, and delivery of WIDA resources focused on Spanish language instruction in the United States and abroad, including the development of Spanish language development standards. Our second panelist, who will be popping on, is Sunny Park Johnson. She is an assistant professor of bilingual bicultural education and director of the bilingual and ESL minors at DePaul College of Education. She's also the co-director of the Bilingual Language Development Lab, a collaborative research group interested in linguistic, educational, and sociolinguistic aspects of bilingualism and second language acquisition. Our third panelist, Joe Luft, is the executive director of the International Network for Public Schools, a network of public high schools focused specifically on providing high quality instruction for recently arrived immigrants. He was also the founding principal of Flushing International High School and a teacher at Brooklyn International High School, both in New York City. Finally, we have Sabrina Wesley-Nero, who is the director of Georgetown University's program in Education, Inquiry, and Justice, and is assistant director of Georgetown's graduate program in educational transformation, including the university's first educator licensure and preparation program. She has taught in elementary Spanish bilingual, Spanish immersion, and English as a second language classrooms. So we're going to begin the conversation by going to Samuel first. So with Spanish being the most widely used language other than English in the US, a great deal of attention has been placed on Spanish-English dual language education programs. So for Samuel, skeptics might argue that within the context of standards-based reform, where English is the language of assessment, focusing on Spanish language development is misguided at best and dangerous at worst. What do you see as the relationship between Spanish language development and standards-based reform, and what implications does this have for education policy and practice?
Thank you, Nelson, and thank you to everyone who's joining us virtually for this conversation today. So I'll start off with this. There's ample research documenting that students with a strong first language have an easier time acquiring a second or additional language. And to your point, more than 70% of students identified as English learners in the United States come from Spanish-speaking households. So the field, of course, has turned their attention to Spanish-English bilingual education programs. But part of the reason for that is that if we build the Spanish, we can get to faster acquisition of the English. And in essence, that's part of the goal, right? This bilingualism, or ideally more than just English language proficiency. Now, we need to take into consideration that students identified as English learners have to take an English language proficiency assessment on an annual basis. Recent guidance in response to COVID-19 from the Department of Education, and this was just issued on May 18th, reiterates that students must meet English language proficiency on a valid and reliable assessment, right, based on federal and legal guidance. So there's no way around it. What we need here is a new approach, one that really leverages the multilingualism of our students, one that goes beyond just looking at English and the academic skills in English, but that leverages the other languages. In this case, I'll stick to Spanish. Right? So what does this mean for standards-based reform? Well, it first off means that we cannot be limited to English language proficiency, or that when we start talking about instruction and assessment, we can't just limit that to the content areas being assessed in English. So mathematics and English, English science, English language arts. We need to start creating spaces that really guide and provide opportunities to assess academic skills in languages other than English. Our students may already know the content, but if they're given only an English assessment in mathematics, they may not be able to demonstrate their full skills. So what we need to explore is additional ways in which we can guide learning in other languages, Spanish included, by designing standards and assessment that can measure the academic skills of students in languages other than English. So I'll conclude with this. There's a place and a location for doing English language proficiency. There's a space for standards and assessment in the content areas in English, but we truly need policy and practice that goes beyond that and allows for other languages to be included in standards-based reform. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And as you noted, I think you said 80% of students who are classified as English learners are Spanish speaking, but of course, while Spanish is certainly the most widely used language other than English in the United States, the US has an estimated 350 languages. And so the next question that I want Sunny to help us think about is thinking about languages other than Spanish and how we should be thinking about those. And so for Sunny, there are over 1 million speakers of Korean in the United States. And I know you've done a lot of research looking at that population. And there are a small but growing number of Korean English dual language programs. So what would you say are the opportunities and challenges of these programs that differ from the opportunities and challenges of Spanish English dual language programs that have gotten more of the attention because of the larger numbers of them? And what should policymakers or educators thinking of creating Korean English programs be considering when they're trying to make these programs?
Yeah, thank you, Nelson. Excellent questions. So I'll start with the opportunities. The nice thing is that we have a nice foundation of Spanish-English dual language programs that we can borrow a lot of information, a lot of pedagogy, curriculum design theory, things like that from. So we don't have to start from scratch as much. The challenges, one of the challenges actually, and this was always surprising to me, is convincing parents that dual language education as the mainstream form of education is worthwhile, that it's a valuable effort. Now, Korean parents are gung-ho about the heritage schools, the Saturday schools. They funnel a lot of energy into that, but they're not so sure. They're very skeptical that dual language works in the mainstream form. Why is that? I think, it's what you would expect. There's a lot of myths surrounding bilingualism, that it causes confusion, that learning in English only half the time means you only get half the amount of English proficiency. Thinking that learning Korean at home is enough, and we'll take care of the Korean at home, you guys take care of the English at school. So that's getting parents really to buy into dual language education has been a challenge, particularly for Korean communities. The other thing that is not just for heritage speakers of Korean, but sort of amongst many of the Korean communities here in the States, is that pervasive myth of the model minority, right? The assumption that, oh, they will be fine, they're hardworking people. You hear these myths and beliefs associated with Asian communities, Korean communities, the assumption that their families are wealthy, they have tons of resources, so that they don't need any of this extra support. They can just go to the mainstream. So I think that those two have been the main challenges for our communities.
Yeah, that homeschool connection is key, and we're going to get back to that in the second round of questions. But so we'll kind of put a pin in that for now, and come back to that important question to kind of pivot towards Joe. So a common argument that I've come across, and I'm sure many of you on the panel and in the audience, is that while framing multilingualism as a resource may be possible in relatively linguistically homogeneous communities, such as in the case of a dual language program, that it becomes impossible in a linguistically heterogeneous community. The Internationalist Network of Public Schools rejects the premise. So could you briefly describe the Internationalist model with a particular focus on how you work to frame the multilingualism of your very linguistically diverse student population as a resource for teaching and learning?
Sure, thanks Nelson, and thanks everyone for joining us. I'll start by saying not only is it possible, I think it's essential. It's a core part of who our students are. We support a network of 28 programs around the country in 6 states plus District of Columbia and about 12 districts, a little under 10,000 students across our network, and they represent, as of our last count, which has probably changed since this panel started, about 119 countries and 93 different languages. So I think we start from the premise that linguistic diversity is the norm, even in a school like some of our schools are, where everyone's first language may be Spanish, but that Spanish heritage represents a very diverse set of Spanish-speaking traditions and Spanish-speaking countries. And so we have schools that range from very linguistically diverse, much more so, to some that are less linguistically diverse, but there's still linguistic diversity in all of those. And one of the things that we talk about all the time is that everyone's a language teacher. It's not really about who your license is, it's about who your students are. So you may be teaching biology, you may be teaching history, you may be an ENL teacher or be teaching a native language class, but you're all language teachers. And so part of our job is to go beyond just saying that and figure out ways to operationalize that and actually support people in building the capacity to do that. So some of the ways that we do that is that one of the core structures in our schools is having teachers work in interdisciplinary teams. So the idea is that you heard this a little bit in the opening session about the importance of collaboration and sustained professional development and implementing standards. If you're going to get beyond just telling people that they're teachers of language, you have to back that up with structures, which means time for people to collaborate and professional learning opportunities for teachers to develop those capacities. And it also means support for leaders and having a clear vision about how that can play out across the school. And we'll talk a little bit more about family involvement later, but it goes beyond instruction, and it requires teachers to take a broader view of what their role is as a teacher. And so I think we think a lot about, it's not so much about the design of the program. Is it officially classified as a bilingual program? If you have students that are coming in who are multilingual, there are lots of opportunities in the classroom and curriculum design in the life of the school to capitalize on that, to bring that to life, and to really build off of it. And I think if we're policing students' language use with each other, we're really constraining their ability to learn. So we should be encouraging them to use every tool that they have in their toolbox. I always use this very bad analogy of, you could ask a carpenter to build something for you and take the hammer out of their toolbox and tell them you can use all the other tools that you have, but we're going to take that one away from you. You could probably bang the nail in with a pair of pliers, but it's going to take you a lot longer, and you're probably going to bend the nail a lot. I just think you want students to be resourceful, you want them to be problem solvers, and you want them to take advantage of everything that they have access to. And I think about there's a video on the teaching channel that the Hewlett Foundation sponsored. It was filmed in one of our schools, and it's in a biology class, and the students are doing a DNA lesson, and two of the students are Mandarin speakers, the other students in the group speak Spanish, and you see them coming in together as a group, speaking in English, talking to each other, conferring in Mandarin and in Spanish. They're figuring things out, and they're coming back together again. It's a really powerful example of translanguaging. And I think if you had told students you must do this work in English and you should not be using your home language, they wouldn't have made meaning as quickly, or as deeply than what they did. And I think we also just need to think about, there are ways to make students' metalinguistic awareness just really obvious and really overt. You can have students talk about their language and share it with each other as you're learning new ideas and new concepts. There are ways to have students with each other and in same language groups, but also across the class to share their language and to share how their language works. It may sound, well, to this panel, right, we've got people with deep experience in linguistics here, may not seem like it would be that interesting. The students often find that it is. They're pretty fascinated by that, about the way that things work in different languages, because most of them have that comparison point because they operate in multiple languages all the time. So I think it's also just a common place of collaboration, but ultimately I think it just comes down to getting beyond saying this, finding real examples in the curriculum and building it into the structures of the school so everybody really sees multilingualism as an asset, and getting beyond rhetoric. So that's really just a part of the way you do business in the school.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so and then a related argument, which is interestingly not necessarily true for the audience in this room, is that sometimes come across as a challenge of supporting teachers in framing multilingualism as a resource when most teachers in the US are themselves monolingual. And I think that it's telling that the audience in this audience tends to be a multilingual audience, but oftentimes maybe monolingual teachers don't necessarily see multilingualism as something they should be thinking about to begin with, right? Which is part of the challenge that I think we face. So for Sabrina, as someone who has worked with pre-service and in-service teachers in developing transformative educational practices, what dispositions would you say teachers should have in relation to multilingualism in their classroom? And how might this be enacted differently for teachers who are monolingual versus those who are bi or multilingual?
Great. Yeah, thanks, Nelson. That's a great question, and thank you for everyone who's here. A lot of it, the things that we work with our educators and aspiring educators to operationalize, really connects to what Joe was sharing that happens at his schools and in the schools in the network. It's really a disposition where we actually value and respect diversity, but have a broad definition of what diversity is. So for multilingual educators, is really thinking about that within group diversity, the linguistic diversity that actually inhabits groups that may speak the same language or check the same the box on the form, but there's a lot of linguistic richness that happens within a Korean American community or a Spanish speaking community, right? And for monolingual educators, is really helping them avoid prioritizing or ranking student strengths, right? And it's like, I really value the strength this student brings in because they have advanced knowledge of science. With looking at multilingual students as the richness and the strengths they bring in from their linguistic heritages and their cultural heritage, how do we actually operationalize culturally relevant education? How do we actually act out the value of diversity? And then just really having the educators animate something we want students to have. We said we want students to be lifelong learners. How do educators animate that disposition of being a lifelong learner? How do they actually go from year to year, from class to class with an open mind, saying, how can I learn about this group of learners, these families, these communities in ways that are meaningful, and add to and sometimes challenge the previous set of knowledge I thought I developed last year, no matter how long I've been in this classroom or this school with this community. So how are we actually living out a value and respect for a wide, broad range of diversity, and honoring the linguistic resources and cultural heritage of our students? And how are we actually living out the process of being a lifelong learner ourselves in a way that kind of respects the diversity within groups, and also the diversity we have in our own history and background as well.
Thank you for that. And then kind of getting back to Sunny now. So Sunny, you mentioned Korean heritage language schools and suggested that actually for Korean parents, oftentimes those are more desirable options even than a dual language program. So like in response to a continued lack of Korean English dual language options, and because of perhaps more buy-in into these programs, there are large numbers of Korean heritage language schools. And I find that many teachers who work with Korean students aren't even aware that they are in these schools. So could you speak a little bit about what these programs are and what you think classroom teachers should know about these programs that would allow them to better frame the multilingualism of their Korean students as a resource?
Absolutely. Yeah, the heritage language schools, or I'll call them Saturday schools, that's what we call them. They've really become a major part of the Korean American youth experience. It's almost a rite of passage. Everyone has a story of, oh, not wanting to get up on a Saturday morning, but they were forced to go to Saturday school by mom or dad. And what's funny is that what we see in the research and what we see anecdotally too, these schools are often the only opportunity for Korean students to be in a classroom where they are the majority, where they don't have to explain themselves, where their identities aren't questioned. They don't have to constantly defend themselves or explain why mom is like this or what they eat for breakfast. And so we find that the biggest benefit of these Korean Saturday schools aren't actually language development, but the biggest benefit is actually as exploring and affirming their cultural identity. It's the one place where they don't have to pretend to be white, pretend to be native English speakers. They can trans-language code switch with their friends, their teachers. They don't get funny looks for being how they are. But like you said, Nelson, the sad thing is come Monday morning, they're back to being the white version of themselves, if I could say that. And Saturday school is never really talked about. It's never asked about. Like you said, the teachers don't even really know that these students go to school on Saturday. And everyone, you know, if it does come up, it just, oh, you poor thing, your evil parents sent you to Saturday school, and it becomes a point of pity. So my recommendation for classroom teachers is to really know that this is a common thing for their Korean students, and even if they do complain about it, they're getting something that the mainstream educational system is just not providing for them, right? Affirmation that they're not strange, they're not weird for being bilingual, they're not weird for eating strange foods or having a different family life, or, you know, the tension of being one thing at school and one thing at home. And if you, to bring this back to the standards issue, if you look at Common Core, you see standards like, you know, collaborative conversations with diverse partners, asking questions from multiple avenues of exploration, choosing flexibility from a range of strategies. These are all things that bilinguals are great at, right? And so drawing from their abilities rather than silencing them, rather than ignoring them, I think it's a really powerful way to make this valuable, right? Really consider these students as a resource.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I just want to kind of add briefly, of course, there are other programs that are Saturday schools that are not Korean as well, right? So it's always for teachers to ask, are they doing this? Are they doing these schools, and what we can get from them? Certainly the Korean community has a very strong network of those. But we should always be asking our students what types of language opportunities they're having outside of the classrooms, because they really are important to connect.
Absolutely.
To, the school, and that kind of gets us to kind of the next topic that I was hoping that we could touch upon is oftentimes the challenge in making these homeschool connections, especially when there is a language barrier, and especially in contexts where schools are extremely linguistically diverse, like the Internationals Network. So for Joe, how do you and your network work to make homeschool connections? And what are some concrete tools that you would suggest for other schools working to bridge the gap between home and school, especially when they're serving linguistically diverse student populations?
I mean, I'd start by saying, just going back to what I had said earlier about thinking of the teacher's role in a broader context. So they're part of an instructional team. One of the things we do in our schools is that teachers also have built-in time as a team to meet with a counselor or a social worker in the school. That's partially professional development for the teachers to help build their capacity to manage some things, but it's also about helping them. They're the ones who know students best. They're spending the most time with them, right? So the idea shouldn't be that you outsource any social emotional problem to someone else, even though there are clearly cases where you need some deeper expertise. But a lot of times teachers are supporting students working through life issues that are coming up. You know, and there's a quote from a teacher in one of our schools that I just heard a few days ago, and was talking about this and the idea that you don't just send a student to the counselor or the social worker. And the teacher said, you know, you wouldn't say to a parent, don't talk to me, go talk to the counselor. You invite them into a team meeting, you meet with them privately, you find other ways to connect with them. It doesn't matter who you are or what your role is. Everyone should be communicating with families. And especially with what's going on right now, I'll say that one of the things that I've heard most loudly and clearly from our schools is by far the most common topic of conversation has been around food insecurity, about being able to pay rent, about getting access to medical care. And in many cases, the school is really the only official institution outside of maybe a religious organization or a community organization that families will often feel comfortable going to for those resources. So I think our schools also just position themselves as a service provider beyond just academic coursework. And I think it's also a question of how do you measure what it means to be engaged with families, right? The traditional measure of you have a monthly PTA meeting and you count the number of bodies that show up at the school, and if that's your measure of success, I'd think of it more as on a daily, weekly basis, how many family members are coming into the school, and then how many opportunities do you have outside of the school to connect with them? Oakland International High School out in the Bay Area does a really amazing thing of these community walks where they're student-led, student-hosted. Students identify a place in the community that they want to share with the adults who work at the school, and organize these and lead them themselves. It's a really important part of the professional development for the staff at the school to understand what students' lives are like outside of school, and for students to be the one to take the lead on that rather than us sort of telling them what's important in the community. And then I think there's a curricular piece of it as well, right? How do we also just sort of build in opportunities so that students are learning outside of the classroom, outside of the building, in the community, but also how are you bringing the broader community into the school in some way by partnering with community organizations or figuring out more meaningful and authentic ways to actually engage with families that are not just the traditional structures that I think are common to most schools.
Yeah, great. And I think that you were alluding to some of the longstanding inequities that have been exacerbated in the context of the COVID crisis, right? And so kind of transitioning to Sabrina, you're someone who works in teacher education and you're focused on this idea of educational transformation. And so I was wondering, what are some of the issues beyond language? And I think we've already heard some of them that schools and teachers should be addressing and thinking about strengthening homeschool connections when they're working with linguistically diverse students. And how have you worked with teachers at helping to strengthen this connection?
Right, and I think there are two things that definitely stand out for comments that Joe made and that Nelson, you and Sunny made before. The first thing is to recognize that our relationship, educators' relationship with families and students is bi-directional. Any positive relationship, any strong relationship is bi-directional. So we don't really talk to educators about school, home communication in a unidirectional manner. It's like bi-directional communication. So the first thing we ask our educators to do is to ask the families, ask the families what they need, ask the families what works best for them, and have a broad, open mind when it comes to those things. It's not necessarily what do the families need so that my job is easier. What do the family needs broadly, and then use the resources. Use the resources that Joe mentioned and set up in some of the schools in his network. Use resources in the community, right? Connect the families with the resources in ways that if they are secure in their relationship with you, you can be a window and you can be a pathway for other relationships they may need, be it food security, be it job training, educational support, or access to healthcare. Our schools can be kind of these hubs of access for our families, and educators often can develop relationships that are bi-directional and mutually respectful, that families feel comfortable coming to the educators and being the pathway, at least the way to open doors and definitely not close them. Another thing we try to work with our educators to do is to pay attention and just like we broaden our definition of diversity, we broaden our definition of data. So we're not always looking at outcomes and assessments, but looking at which voices have we heard from this week? Who is coming to those meetings? Who's doing the drop off? Who's doing the pickup? If I'm using technology in a way that my families have said work for them for communication, who has responded and who's not? Thinking about the families and the students who are furthest away from opportunity, and what do I need to do to reach them that's outside of the norm, because obviously the norm isn't working and the goal is to reach them. And one of the things we've realized right now in the COVID-19 is the need to be tenacious and persevere and assume good intent, right? So if we're reaching out to families in ways and we're not seeing that they respond, we have to persevere and be tenacious, and also assume that everyone is struggling, right? Everyone has complex and multifaceted lives, and our job is to figure out how else can I communicate with that family? How else can I think about that family holistically, so that if their social emotional needs are met, if their physical needs are met, then their students are going to learn and thrive in my classroom. And that comes back to bi-directional relationships that are built on respect and trust.
Great, thank you. And it seems so important to me to continue to emphasize that if we're going to have a conversation about standards and standards-based reform, it really needs to happen within a broader conversation about the many challenges that confront the communities that our schools are serving. But trying to bring the conversation back into an explicit focus on standards, although I would argue that all of what we were talking about is relevant to thinking about the importance of standards. It seems that one practical way of pushing standards-based reform to frame multilingualism as a resource is to create bilingual or multilingual standards, right? And this is something that WIDA has been kind of trying to do, right? So for Samuel, can you briefly describe the work that you've undertaken at WIDA to develop Spanish language development standards and the Spanish language assessment, and how you see this work as connected to standards-based reform?
Most definitely. And Nelson, to your point, what we heard from Sunny, Joe, and Sabrina, those are definitely core concepts that are reflected in the standards and the work that we're doing here at WIDA. So I really appreciate this conversation and this opportunity to share. So the WIDA-ESPAñOL program in particular, we are focusing on two specific projects that we're going to launch. The first one is a Spanish language arts framework. And the opportunity behind this is to have a policy document that can be used by state education agencies or other local agencies to develop either Spanish language arts standards or to enhance their existing standards for language arts specific to Spanish. The second project is more on language development. So these are actual standards for the Spanish language development, and these will guide curriculum and instruction within the classroom. They also serve as a blueprint for an assessment in Spanish language development. And of course, WIDA is exploring the opportunities for that assessment, and there is a high level of commitment to be able to deliver that to the field in the near future. So as we're looking at both of those pieces, we're also leveraging our expertise on the English side, right? The English language development pieces that WIDA has done for over the last 15 to 20 years. And part of that is bringing in the Canada philosophy, the guiding principles of language development, and these core tenets that are trying to push language development into the academic content, right? And bridging to ensure that we are really taking into account the diversity of our students. There is no one Spanish, right? We have a number of countries all across Latin America and then Spain out in Europe that are using Spanish, and there's a few other countries across the globe. So we're really trying to leverage and bring all of that as we design these concepts for the system here in the United States, right? So some of the core pieces that we have are looking into, first off, translanguaging and transcultural experiences and how those can be built into the standards from the get-go. Adding in multiliteracies and multimodalities as the approach to language arts and language development. and then making sure that we have the necessary considerations for the local social cultural context to be bridged into the conversation, so that these are really crafted and owned locally. Now, regarding standards-based reform, we really need to see this as we explore further into standards and assessment in other languages, right? The work that we're doing here at WIDA-ESPAñOL, I'm hoping that will be a foundational cornerstone to Spanish language education, driven by standards against which student growth and performance can be measured, right? But then that could also serve to inform other work. Sunny mentioned that, oftentimes other linguistic communities leverage what's been done in Spanish to then continue to develop and to enhance their own work. So we're hoping that this also provides that opportunity. The other piece is, of course, being very mindful of students' multilingual and multicultural practices. Our students are living in a space in which they're constantly engaging with multiple languages, be it Spanish at home, English in the school, and then multilingual settings all across public domain. So we want to make sure that we are very cognizant of that. And once again, being very mindful of the local ownership, right? Making sure that we craft these documents and these tools so that educators can then bridge them and have ownership within their classroom as they're implementing. Of course, this work is going to be informed by research and practice, but not just looking at the United States. So specifically, our work is taking us into Spanish-speaking countries all across Latin America to make sure that we're bridging those research factors into our work. The last point I'll make here is that we're also trying to bridge into teacher and professional learning opportunities, right? Because it's not just a matter of putting out the standards, putting out the assessment, and then having teachers trying to figure it out on their own. So one of the other things that WIDA does very strongly is to support all of the states in the consortium through professional learning opportunities for our educators, both at the classroom level and at the administrative level. So we'll continue to do that. And I'll close out with this, Nelson. The ultimate goal for us here at WIDA-ESPAñOL is to really guide instruction for Spanish language development across academic content areas that, when paired with the current learning system that we have for English, it would enable teachers to really have the necessary guidance and supports to create opportunities for students to develop and demonstrate their full linguistic abilities in both English and Spanish. And we can be some of the first organizations that can lead this move and hopefully provide additional opportunities for all their linguistic communities. We'll definitely do that. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So we hope now to hear back from the audience. Before we hear from Erica about any themes she's seeing, I thought we would put the second poll up, which is asking about people's experience with the standards and how well they think the standards are actually framing multilingualism. So just take 30 seconds to fill that out. 1 being the lowest, you think that it's not doing a good job, and 5 being the strongest, being you think that it does do a good job. All right, if we could get the results for that quickly, just to see what the audience is thinking. Oh, well, it seems like most are at 1 or 2. And then there are some 3s that seem kind of ambivalent. Maybe they're doing okay, it depends. But very few who think that the standards are doing a good job at really seeing multilingualism as a resource. So if we could just close that poll out. And hear from Erica, are there any themes or questions that you got from the audience?
Yes, thank you. There's actually quite a few questions for Samuel regarding some of the status of Spanish language standards and assessments from WIDA. So the first of those is, are there any updates on the release of a Spanish language assessment that schools and districts and states might be able to take a look at soon?
So not in the immediate future. So right now what we are conducting is a number of studies to figure out and make sure that we are addressing the needs of our educators. So what we're going to be seeing this fall is a national inquiry that WIDA-ESPAñOL is going to be conducting to really gauge what our educators are looking for, both from the classroom teacher to the school administrator to the district administrator and even state education agencies. We're going to bring in all of that data, and that's really going to inform our path to the development of this assessment for Spanish language development.
Great, thank you so much. And a related question that came up a couple of times from the attendees is, when there are so many different standards in Spanish, you have, the ones in 2013, you have the ones that the states might develop themselves. how do curriculum developers start to begin to think about the different competing standards and which ones might be most beneficial to them in bilingual education contexts?
So one key distinction that is at the foundation of all of these conversations, so that should be addressed pretty early in that component, is the difference between language development and language arts, right? So as I mentioned, WIDA is working on two projects that they're both grounding on language instruction, but one is more on the language arts piece, which is the ultimate use and application of the skill, being able to interpret readings and being able to produce high quality writing in academic settings in Spanish. The other one is the language development approach, which is more of the linguistic side of that, the actual development of the language that you can engage fully with academic content. So once we have those two defined, then we can really look at either language arts standards, which are more addressing, once again, the literature and the reading and the writing of Spanish language, and then the language development standards. So there are multiple standards out there, right? Common Core in Espanol comes to mind as a main one that is being used for language arts. And then, of course, the WIDA 2013 edition of the Spanish Language Development Standards. Both of those documents we know need updating and that they need to be revisited. But one of the things that we're hoping to do with the language arts framework is that districts who are already using Common Core in Espanol or other locally designed language arts standards are able to enhance their current standards by looking at an item or a component that is originally constructed for Spanish and not a transadaptation or translation of the English language arts, right, as was with Common Core in Espanol. The other component is, of course, the language development. Once we are able to kind of go through this process, we're hoping to deliver a brand new set of Spanish language development standards. Once we have those out in the market, then, of course, a lot of curriculum developers and even schools who develop their own curriculum can take those on to guide the development of their curriculum and their lessons to guide instruction. Ultimately, once there's an assessment, then we have a full system that is looking at the standards, the curriculum, and the aligned assessment that can show us growth and what the students can accomplish.
Great, thank you so much, Samuel. Another question that came up in the midst of multiple of your conversations and your responses to Nelson's questions was, to what extent are we also thinking about Black communities and Sunday schools that they have, and what are the linkages that we can draw to heritage language education programs like the ones that Suni talked about with Korean language? How are we thinking about multiple varieties of English in the context of multilingualism? And that's sort of an open question to anyone who would like to begin.
Nelson, I can begin on that. So I think this is one of the tenets that we work with our educators and aspiring educators is really broadening our definition of diversity, right? And really kind of having an internal process or strategy where we're questioning our assumptions, right? So we think about African-American students or Black students, one way we think about is variety of English that they may speak in the classroom, they may bring in as also as a linguistic resource, but also of the racial and ethnic diversity within other linguistic communities, right? So we know that we have a small but growing community of students who might identify as Black, and they also might be Spanish speakers at home, and they may have a different linguistic richness and diversity that they bring into the classroom. But if we actually can value and respect the broad linguistic and cultural diversity that all students bring in, then we are also valuing the different varieties of English African-American students bring in and the different variety of maybe Spanish or varieties of Korean or other languages that students come in, and we can kind of take our blinders off and that we're not looking for one quote unquote standard version of any of the languages and realize that our students come in with full linguistic resources and they can all be valued and leveraged so that they become multilingual and they become successful academically in the areas of their pursuits in school.
If I could add to that too, Nelson, I 100% agree with Sabrina. Looking at these language systems that might be different than what we consider, quote unquote, the standard, these differences are just that, they're differences. You know, you might have a different verb conjugation. You might use double negatives. In fact, many of the world's languages use double negatives. Why is that bad for one dialect of English and okay for all these other languages in the world, right? So a lot of these qualities that we place as problems with certain dialects, they're not problems with the language. They're social problems, and they're assigned to these values that we might have of certain communities. And I think that that is a myth and a misunderstanding that we need to bust at every level. One of which I think is at the teacher preparation level, is to really make sure that our teachers, or our pre-service teachers, are getting some content in linguistics, but also language diversity, sociolinguistics. I have my students who are pre and in-service teachers do a project where they have to do a linguistic report on a minority language or minority dialect. So, you know, taking Caribbean Spanishes, which are often somehow seen as less than, even though they're fully fledged languages with beautiful, rich systems, they're seen that way in society. And so doing these projects, I think, really opens their eyes to the complexities, the expectation that you have to be monolingual, or you have to speak like two monolinguals glued back to back in order to be a fully proficient bilingual. It busts some of these myths, and I think it's an important step.
We are unfortunately out of time. This is an amazing conversation. I've learned so much from all of you today. People who still have follow-up questions, the panelists have all graciously agreed to respond to emails if you have emails that you wanted to follow up with them on. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I just wanted to end with a final thought that I had before kind of transitioning people to the next panel, is that something that makes me sad is that sometimes I find that students' home language practices are most disrespected in classrooms that are native language arts classrooms, where they're supposed to be learning in their home language. And that's something that I think we also need to think about, in addition to thinking about all of these different variations of English that oftentimes get erased in conversations about bilingualism and multilingualism. So can we just go to the next slide? So thanks for joining us. So just a reminder for those of you who are participating in the closing keynote, which will be between Andy Porter and Linda Darling-Hamming. It begins at 1:30, which is about 15 minutes from now. If you haven't already registered, you can still register and get the link here. All sessions are also being recorded and will be available online. So you can feel free to share this panel with others that you think might find it illuminating. I certainly learned so much from everybody here. And this definitely went better than I imagined it. I was worried that we would have technology issues and everything, but it ran really smoothly. And I think that's the last slide, right? I don't think I need to give people any other information. Feel free to also email me, anyone who wants to have follow-up conversations with me as well. Thanks again to the panelists. I know clapping is kind of like awkward here, but I'll clap for the panelists here. Thank you to the audience for coming. And I believe that it will stay open for a little bit, but then I encourage everyone to go to the final plenary because I'm sure it'll be an interesting conversation. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.